Immigration stories indicate more than 300,000 immigrants migrate to Canada on an average every year. Moving to Canada and figuring out where you want to locate seems challenging if you don't have strong ties to a particular city or province. Immigrants generally prefer moving to some of the most famous Canadian cities like Toronto, Montreal, Halifax, Ottawa, Calgary, Vancouver, and so on. Most people prefer moving to the province of Ontario or British Columbia for personal reasons. And this video is a comparison between the two most famous Canadian cities, namely Toronto and Vancouver. We will be comparing these two cities based on several factors, including geography, of course, where it's being located, and the population, like what the size of the population and what the ethnicity they share. Weather, of course, is important, employment, cost of living, time zone, and public transportation, and so on. So here is the Canadian map, friends, and let's first talk about the geography of these two cities where they are being located. And in first place, Toronto falls towards the eastern region of Canada, whereas Vancouver towards the west. And the closest ocean for Toronto should be Atlantic, which is 2,120 kilometers driving distance from Toronto, whereas the closest ocean for Vancouver should be Pacific, which is a driving distance of 246 kilometers only, which is again in miles. If you want to consider, it's 153 miles. And of course, Toronto is bounded to the Lake Ontario to the south and by Humber River, whereas Vancouver is bounded to the north by English Bay and the Burrard Inlet and Fraser River. And as most of you must be familiar, Toronto is based in the province of Ontario, whereas Vancouver is based in the province of British Columbia. And Toronto is the largest city of Canada and as well the largest city in the province of Ontario, whereas Vancouver is the largest city in the province of British Columbia as well. And the landscape, Vancouver is pretty much hilly and flat, whereas Toronto is flat in structure. We discussed demographics in these two cities, and in first place, Vancouver, which has a population of 25,81,583 people living in the urban areas of Vancouver, and there are 6 lakh people living in the city of Vancouver. And of course, Vancouver is a tourist hotspot, and at the same time it's one of the educated cities in Canada. And on the other hand, Toronto, it has 61,98,353 people living in the urban areas of Toronto, and there are 26 lakh of people living in the city of Toronto. Racial composition in these two cities, Toronto, which has white Canadians 50.2%, East Asians 12.7%, South Asians 12.3%, Blacks 8.5%. Then again we have Southeast Asians 7% and Latin Americans 2.8%, West Asians 2%, Arabs 1.1%, Aboriginals 0.7%, and the other constitutes 1.5%. 48% of the population in Toronto is immigrant, whereas when we compare the racial composition in the city of Vancouver, we see white Canadians 46%, Chinese 28%, South Asian 6%, Filipino 6%, immigrants, therefore we see 40%. And I should be telling you the fact this is a census report as per 2016, and by now, as we have passed for almost 4 years now, it should be, and I read some articles, it states it should be the immigrants in Vancouver should be around 40 to 45%, and Toronto it should be 50 plus. Now let's discuss about the weather in Canada. Weather is very, very important, especially if you are someone who is figuring out which city you want to go. You want to know what's the kind of weather in each city and differences during winter versus summer and so on. And generally Canada has got 4 seasons like winter, spring, summer, fall. And much more than that, today we discuss Toronto versus Vancouver in terms of weather, how they are doing. Winter can be tougher in Toronto than Vancouver. Generally, Vancouver has mild and rainy weather, also dry and hot summer, whereas Toronto, summer is more of humid and hot. Now let's look at the table which showcase the weather reporting from both the cities Vancouver and Toronto, and this reporting is from 2019. Let's look at July 2019. Vancouver has a minimum of 10.4 degrees Celsius and maximum of 28.5, whereas Toronto has a minimum of 14.3 and a maximum of 33 degrees Celsius. So in other words, when Vancouver has a maximum of 28.5 versus Toronto has a maximum of 33 degrees Celsius. Now let's look at during winter in terms of Jan or February. Well, let's look at Jan 2019, which has a minimum of -3 and a maximum of 11.3 in Vancouver, whereas Toronto has -22.8 and a maximum of 8.2. So we can see the difference when Vancouver has -3, Toronto has -22.8. So this is not always the same, but at the same time we are able to figure out in terms of whether Vancouver is doing much better, and that's one of the primary reasons quite a lot of people prefer moving to Vancouver than Toronto, primarily because of weather. Also, moving into these cities, people want to ensure that they are able to obtain appropriate jobs in their field. And let's see employment opportunities in both these cities. Toronto has opportunities, especially in the fields of financial services, fashion and apparels, design, music, films, life sciences, technology, and aerospace, whereas Vancouver has pretty much they are similar, but there are a little bit of differences, including financial services, agriculture and fishing, films, tourism, retail business, construction, manufacturing, and technology. Also, both the cities have extensive opportunities for healthcare professionals. Well, now let's discuss about the minimum wage ratio in both these provinces. British Columbia had a minimum wage ratio of $13.85 per hour, which was changed now to $14.60 per hour from June 1st, 2020, whereas Toronto has a minimum wage ratio of $14 per hour, and there is an increment to the minimum wage, the 25 cents, which comes into effect from October the 1st, 2020, and then it will become hopefully $14.25 per hour. And let me also admit the fact that these are not the only opportunities in these two provinces, but there are several other opportunities, and they are always looking for immigrants to fill the positions in these two cities. Cost of living, when we consider, they are pretty much similar in both the cities by 2020, and I would recommend to you the site numbeo.com, I hope I pronounced it right, which provides us a better understanding about in terms of comparison when you want to compare. And when you consider the consumer price in Vancouver are 0.05% lower than in Toronto, primarily rent, restaurants, and so on. The grocery, on the other hand, is a bit higher in Vancouver when we consider. And again, restaurants, let's look at restaurant. The Mac meal in Toronto is $12 and an equivalent in Vancouver is $10. And again, if you want to consider vegetables, tomato 1 kilo is 3.62 in Toronto, whereas in Vancouver it's 4.53. So looking at the chart, pretty much you can compare back and forth, and then you can make your own conclusions and assumptions and differences. Now, in terms of cost of living index, we can see Vancouver, Toronto are pretty much they are similar, close by, and then we can also consider other cities and then consider where you want to move depending on the cost of living. Also guys, earlier it was an understanding that Vancouver is a more expensive place than Toronto, but now when we consider the cost of living, we realize Vancouver has become slightly cheaper than living in the city of Toronto. Now let's discuss time zones. Unlike other countries, Canada has different time zones. For example, Vancouver falls under Pacific Daylight Times, whereas Toronto falls under Eastern Daylight Times. So there is pretty much 3 hours difference between Toronto and Vancouver, and then you can see the map variation in times, where for example when Vancouver has 12, Alberta is 1 p.m. and Manitoba is 2, and then you can see Quebec for example 3 p.m. and Newfoundland Standard Time 4:30 p.m. So there is always a difference in each province, depends on where you are. And also there is a 1 hour increase during winter to match with the weather, and that's pretty much about time zones in Canada. Well, in terms of public transportation, they have got trains, they have got buses like any other cities. And in first place, they have got trains from the international airports to downtowns of both the cities, and they're able to use train service within the city as well to connect with other provinces. And of course, Vancouver seems to be more advanced in terms of they have the Sky Train, whereas Toronto has the subway system, which is a very very old one. But at the same time, Toronto has as well streetcar, which is a good thing to go around within the city. In terms of ocean and lake transport system, Vancouver has got sea bus, whereas Toronto has ferry. And if you want to know about the monthly pass in these two cities, TTC in Toronto is $146.25, whereas in Vancouver you have one zone adult pass which is $91 and two zone is $124. Still, Vancouver is much cheaper compared to Toronto. So that's it. Hope it was helpful, the comparison between Toronto versus Vancouver. And if you're someone who is considering between these two cities, my assumption is this little video has answered most of your queries. And if you really like the video, give me a thumbs up, and do not forget to share with your family and friends. Hope it will be helpful for others as well. And if you have not subscribed my channel, please make sure to subscribe my channel, which is Benny's.